Have you ever noticed that life seems to flow better the moment you stop worrying? It may sound counterintuitive, especially when we've been taught all our lives that success requires effort, struggle, and persistence. But what if the real obstacle isn't a lack of effort, but our attachment itself? Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, proposed a radical idea. The more you try to control life, the more it slips through your fingers. And perhaps, just perhaps, letting go is the only true path to freedom. Stay with me, because this shift in perspective might just change everything. We cling to how we think things should be, the perfect relationship, the dream job, the stable future. But the tighter our grip, the more those things elude us. What we call security is often just a cage built from unmet expectations. Paradoxically, it's only when we release control that life begins to breathe. Jung said, "What you resist persists, what you accept transforms." Our culture glorifies control, effort, and constant striving as if peace were always one step away. But that compulsive need to make everything work might be the very thing preventing anything real from happening. Letting go is not giving up. It's not apathy. It's a quiet inner movement, from the compulsion to control to the clarity of self-awareness. To Jung, detachment wasn't emotional coldness. It was a necessary psychic step. The ego must separate from its projections for something more authentic to emerge. As long as we are trapped by our projections onto people, desires, idealized futures, we can't clearly see what's actually happening inside us. It's natural to want things to go well, but problems arise when our identity becomes entangled with outcomes. If I am my success, my relationship, or my recognition, then failure, rejection, or even silence become existential threats. That's when anxiety is born. Fear, the desperate need to control. Jung believed this constant inner tension is simply the ego trying to preserve an illusion. Everything changes when we stop fighting the current of life, not out of defeat, but because we finally see clearly. Letting go isn't falling into the void, it's making room for something new, something we don't have to force into existence. It's an act of trust in a greater intelligence moving beneath our life's events. When this surrender is real, confusion becomes clarity. Opportunities emerge without being chased. What once caused anxiety transforms into presence. So no, detachment doesn't mean abandoning your dreams. It means no longer forcing them. It's stepping out of the prison of "this must happen" and into a space of lucid observation. When we stop identifying with what we chase, we get closer to who we truly are, and that's when, quietly, things begin to align. But here's the twist. What if the attachment isn't really to the other person, goal, or outcome, but to something we ourselves projected onto it? We rarely cling to what is. We cling to what we imagine. We project salvation onto people, validation, roles they never agreed to play. Jung was clear. What we refuse to face within ourselves, we tend to see in others, distorted or idealized. That's where attachment is born. The ego, craving control and recognition, tries to possess the external world as an extension of itself. We don't attach because something is valuable in itself. We attach because we've assigned it meaning tied to our inner lack. The longing to be loved may show up as emotional dependency. The fear of insignificance may morph into obsession with achievement. What looks like love or ambition is often just an attempt to fill an inner void. These projections act like warped lenses. We don't see people for who they are, we see what we need them to be. That's why disappointment is inevitable. No one can carry a role they never chose. Attachment is the illusion of fusion. If I keep you close, if I please you, if I control you, then I'll be whole. But that wholeness is fragile, because it depends on something outside of us. Jung observed that the psyche projects in order to protect itself from unconscious content it's not ready to face. It's easier to believe someone rejected us than to feel our own fear of not being enough. Easier to blame the world for our emptiness than to recognize we've abandoned parts of ourselves. When we become aware of these projections, everything reorganizes. We realize that our attachment isn't about the other, it's about what we haven't yet faced in ourselves. And in that moment, reality begins to shift. The other is no longer a mirror of our wounds, but simply themselves. Releasing projection isn't easy, but it's liberating. It's the beginning of a more honest relationship with ourselves and with everything around us. When we recognize the inflated ego trying to dominate, we create space for a more grounded presence, one that seeks connection, not possession. But what happens when our projections fail? The ego panics. It tries to tighten its grip on what cannot be controlled. There's a profound difference between having direction and needing to control every step. The first comes from inner alignment. The second is fear disguised as competence. We try to plan, predict, and manage every outcome, believing it will keep us safe. But over-control is just the ego's way of avoiding the inevitable, the uncertainty of life. Jung once said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Control in this sense is anesthesia. Instead of feeling, we fill our minds with strategies. Instead of embracing vulnerability, we hide behind routines, goals, and promises, believing that constant vigilance will protect us from pain. But controlling isn't living, it's surviving in an artificial bubble. In trying to eliminate unpredictability, we also kill spontaneity, the very thing that makes life fresh, real, and vibrant. Relationships grow mechanical. Work becomes a burden. Life becomes full of tasks, but empty of meaning. The ego insists there's a right way to live, an ideal model to follow, and every deviation from that model brings guilt, anxiety, and self-criticism. The mind enters overdrive like an overloaded operating system. Burnout isn't a personal failure, it's a predictable outcome of this way of being. In the end, control is just fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough, fear of being truly seen. But when we finally stop running, when we face what's real, something extraordinary happens. Life begins again, not as a fight to be won, but as a mystery to be lived. Surrendering doesn't mean giving up. It means accepting that there are forces within us and in life that go beyond personal will. Carl Jung saw the unconscious not as a passive reservoir, but as a living, autonomous intelligence that actively shapes reality. When we ignore this dimension, we get stuck in the narrow logic of the rational mind, believing everything can be solved through thinking alone. Letting go of control is therefore an act of trust. It's an acknowledgement that there is wisdom in chaos, and that unpredictability may itself be a path. It doesn't mean drifting aimlessly, but rather making space for life to surprise us, something that rarely happens when we attempt to control even silence. The more we try to ensure everything sticks to a plan, the more we drift from ourselves. But the more we allow ourselves to listen, observe, and feel without rushing to intervene, the more we begin to sense that life has its own rhythm, one that often knows exactly where it's taking us. What if real freedom lies not in mastering life, but in releasing the ego's grip on it? Abandoning the need to manage everything outside of us can be a return to what's truest inside. That moment when the ego, exhausted from its efforts to control, begins to loosen its hold, is the moment it turns towards something deeper, the self. In Jungian psychology, the self is the center of the psyche, the totality of who we are. It's not the social me or the role we perform, but what remains when we stop performing. As long as the ego is in charge, life tends to organize around external expectations, how we should act, how we should appear, what others expect from us. Stepping away from these scripts initiates a return not to the past but to our essence. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who we truly are by integrating conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. This isn't a theoretical path. It begins in small ruptures. The moment you no longer respond to an old pattern, the moment you resist rushing to fill the void after a breakup and instead choose to sit with it. These moments of detachment are gateways. They may not offer immediate comfort, but they make space for authenticity. Real surrender begins when the ego recognizes its limits, when it realizes it no longer needs to pretend it has all the answers or control over everything. That's when something quieter begins to stir within. The self doesn't impose, it doesn't shout, it guides with a kind of calm clarity. Its signals don't come from logic, but from resonance, from the things that feel deeply right, even if they can't yet be explained. This kind of detachment isn't passivity, it's a more refined presence. It's action without obsession over results. It's love without the demand for reciprocity. It's creation without the hunger to prove something. What drives this state is no longer the craving for approval, but an internal coherence that doesn't need applause to stand strong. In the process of individuation, the ego doesn't disappear, it relocates. Instead of believing it's the master of truth, it begins to serve the self. And this shift changes everything. Relationships become more genuine, decisions more meaningful, and life, once something to conquer, becomes something to live. In this sense, detachment is not loss, but integration. It's allowing what must leave to go and letting what's ready to emerge come forward. In that gesture, we stop existing as characters and begin living as whole beings. But for the self to truly emerge, another armor must be dismantled. The persona. A central concept in Jung's thought, the persona is the social mask we wear to be accepted. It serves a purpose. We need it to function in society. But when we identify too strongly with it, we begin living to sustain an idea rather than a truth. Being the strong one, the spiritual one, the successful one, the model son or daughter, each of these labels can seem positive, even virtuous, but they come at a cost, constant self-surveillance to preserve the image. It's exhausting. Worse, it creates distance, because no one can be whole while carrying the burden of always representing something. Jung saw the persona as necessary, but limited, a bridge between the inner and outer worlds. The problem arises when we forget there's something beyond it. When attachment to the image becomes so rigid that any threat to it triggers fear, irritation, or defensiveness, we're no longer living, we're managing impressions. Liberation begins when we realize we are not obligated to uphold any fixed narrative. We can fail, change our minds, contradict who we were yesterday. We can be honest about how we feel now. That's where authenticity starts, even if it's uncomfortable. Distancing from the persona is radical because it demands courage. The courage to be seen without armor, to allow ourselves to be who we are, even if it shatters the carefully built image. But it's also freeing. It's like stepping out of a badly written role and finally breathing as the author of your own lines. Jung summed it up beautifully. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Attachment to the image is a waking dream, the belief that we are only what we show. Awakening happens when we look inward and recognize the complexity that no mask can contain. That recognition is the beginning of real life. Behind that mask, however, lies what we most fear to face. The shadow. Freedom is frightening. Many desire it, but few are truly ready to meet it face to face, because being free means there's nowhere left to hide. Not in personas, not in roles, not in promises. It means taking responsibility for ourselves, including the parts we'd rather avoid. And it is there, in that inner territory, that the shadow lives. For Jung, the shadow represents the repressed aspects of the psyche, everything we deny, ignore, or find unacceptable in ourselves. It's not necessarily evil, it's simply what was hidden because it didn't fit the image we wanted to present. The more we repress it, the more power it gains in the background of our lives. We claim to want freedom, yet often we fear what comes with it, the emptiness, the silence, the lack of external validation. So we cling to others, to work, to idealized futures, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of what might surface when all the things we lean on are gone. That's why detachment can be painful, because letting go doesn't just mean releasing what's outside, it means facing what's inside. What remains when desire is denied? What shows up when a relationship ends, when a plan fails, when an image collapses? In that raw space, the shadow appears, and it doesn't come gently. Sometimes it arrives as rage, envy, deep sadness, feelings we'd rather not admit. But it takes courage to walk through this tunnel without sugarcoating the experience. Jung said there is no enlightenment without facing the darkness of the soul. It's in this passage that real transformation happens. When we stop fearing the shadow, it stops controlling us in hidden ways. We begin to integrate these forgotten parts, our needs, fears, and vulnerabilities, not to be ruled by them, but to stop being ruled by the denial of them. At the edges, detachment becomes more than letting go of another. It becomes a reunion with what we were taught to reject. The shadow is not what keeps us from living. It is what we must welcome in order to truly live. And only those who cross this inner terrain with honesty can experience that freedom which depends on nothing outside of themselves. So where does the shadow hide? Often in the place we least expect it, in the bonds we call love. It's easy to confuse love with need. The line between wanting to be with someone and fearing to be without them can be thin, but it makes all the difference. Jung said that true love begins only when projection ends. As long as we're attached to what the other represents, we can't see them clearly, nor ourselves. Idealization is natural in the early stages of a relationship, but when it lingers, it becomes a prison disguised as affection. We project onto the other our emotional salvation, our sense of safety, even our identity. Without realizing it, we create dependency. The other ceases to be a person, they become a role. And that's when attachment sneaks in, not as love or intimacy, but as fear disguised as affection, fear of loss, fear of inadequacy, fear of the void that might emerge in their absence. This fear breeds jealousy, control, anxiety. The other must stay or we fall apart. But love that needs to hold tight isn't love, it's lack. A relationship built on control isn't connection, it's a contract of mutual insecurity. And when these ties dissolve, what remains? Often the truth, yes, we love the other, but we also use them as a shield against parts of ourselves we haven't yet embraced. In this context, detachment doesn't mean loving less. It means beginning to love more cleanly. Letting the other exist without needing to occupy a fixed role in our emotional architecture means loving without possession, relating to the real person rather than the projection we've built. This demands maturity. The ability to accept that the other is free, can change, can even leave, and still remain worthy of our affection. It requires an inner restructuring, where instead of seeking wholeness in the other, we find a foundation within ourselves to love without losing ourselves. Non-possessive love isn't cold or distant. On the contrary, it's more present, calm, yet profound, because it doesn't feed on anxiety. It's when the we doesn't erase the I, when being together doesn't mean disappearing into the other, but rather sharing one's own wholeness. When the projection ends, real relationship begins. Not perfect, but possible. An encounter between two consciousnesses that neither dissolve nor merge, but recognize each other, and thus allow love to happen with freedom. But holding up the show of roles and dependencies drains our vital energy. A moment comes when the effort to maintain it all simply fails. The persona created to carry expectations and ideals starts to crumble. The strength that once seemed to come from control becomes a weight, and the exhaustion that seemed physical reveals itself as existential. The ego is tired. This weariness isn't laziness or weakness. It's a silent cry from the unconscious, a forced pause, as if something within says, "I can't pretend anymore." And it's right there that the self begins to emerge. Not in euphoria, but with a strange peace that comes when something ends. Jung saw these collapses as calls for truth. Inner disarray today is not just overstimulation, but an excess of people, roles, and expectations, with too little alignment to what we truly feel. Living to maintain an image demands constant effort, measuring words, emotions, reactions, always being in control. But when the body starts to falter, the mind goes blank, the will vanishes, something deeper must be faced. Who are we without all this? That's when detachment shows up as a real alternative, not an escape, but a liberation. You realize you don't need to force anything anymore. You don't need to prove anything. You can stop, and in stopping, you don't disappear. You actually begin to appear more truthfully. The ego resists, fearing that without effort, everything will collapse. But surrender isn't failure. It's a form of psychic intelligence, an acknowledgement of limits, and a refusal to push past them into emptiness. Jung understood that the psyche, when ignored, creates symptoms. But when listened to, it creates paths. The exhaustion of the persona is an invitation to breathe outside the performance, to ask what truly still matters, and to admit that sometimes, before reinventing ourselves, we just need to rest. To let the weight of performance drop and allow something more authentic to rise in its place. And when the persona crumbles, what's left is a kind of grief that few speak of, the mourning for what we never were. Much is said about detachment as liberation, little about the pain it carries, because letting go is also a kind of death, not physical, but symbolic, and often just as intense. Letting go of an idea, a relationship, a future projection means mourning what never came to be, and that grief is real. Jung didn't see suffering as an error to fix, but as a necessary process of transformation. There is no rebirth without death, he said, and this holds for both external and internal cycles. When something must leave, a failed project, a lost love, an outdated identity, there is a rupture, and every rupture, even when needed, hurts. In this context, detachment isn't a cold, rational decision. It's a deep, emotional process that often pulls us into silence, doubt, and vulnerability. There's a void that opens when what we leaned on vanishes, and even if that void is fertile, it's frightening at first. Ambivalence is common. Relief and sadness, freedom and loneliness, courage and fear. All are part of the psychic grief, not just for the loss itself, but for the collapse of the internal image of how things should have been. The ego suffers. It wants answers, meaning, explanations, but the self operates with a different, more circular logic. Sometimes what doesn't manifest is exactly what forces us to look inward, to re-examine our values, to rebuild a foundation, to abandon a plan that no longer belonged to us, even if it still felt familiar. Honoring that grief is as vital as letting it go, because only by passing through pain without denial can we emerge transformed. It's not about clinging to suffering, but not skipping over it. Suffering lived with awareness has its own right timing, and in that time, something ripens. Detachment then also becomes the art of confronting invisible losses, the ones that leave no visible scars but deeply mark the soul. It's within that quiet scar that a new life slowly begins to take form, not as a promise, but as a possibility. When what bound us finally loosens, something strange happens. The world doesn't end, it reorganizes. The silence that once felt threatening becomes fertile. The void that scared us turns into space. And in that space, things begin to sprout that could never grow before, when everything was crowded with control, expectation, and noise. It's like opening a window after years of being sealed in. The dust dances in the light, the air shifts. At first, it feels strange, a quiet discomfort, but slowly the breath returns, and with it, presence. The mind stops chasing and begins at last to listen, to the body, to time, to life's subtle signals. Imagine someone who stayed in a relationship for years without true connection, held there by fear, attachment, habit. When that person finally lets go, not just of the other, but of the illusion that it had to continue, there's a hit, silence, emptiness. But right after comes space. And in that space, she starts to write again, to cook without obligation, to want to go out alone, to listen to music in the dark, to do something without needing to show it to anyone. That's when creativity returns, not as duty, but as expression. Jung spoke of the psychic energy that becomes available when we stop feeding the ego's defense mechanisms. All the energy we once used to control, to hold on, to maintain a facade or illusion, suddenly returns to us. And that energy needs direction. That's where creation is born, not only artistic creation, but existential creation. To create isn't just to paint a picture or write a poem. It's to rebuild your home, to take a new path, to choose a job that honors your rhythm. It's to transform pain into practical wisdom. Creation begins when you stop reacting and start choosing with awareness. And that only happens when you have inner space. It's in that space that intuition begins to speak again. Once drowned by the noise of anxiety and expectation, it now finds its voice. You begin to see connections where before there were only problems. An idea comes to you in the shower. A solution arises effortlessly after days of trying to force it. You stop thinking to find and start feeling to perceive. Even your sense of time changes. The day no longer feels like a battlefield. You slow down, not out of laziness but alignment. Decisions feel lighter because you're no longer trying to prove anything. And curiously, the things that once seemed unreachable begin to come to you. Not by magic, but because you've stopped resisting the flow. Think of a blocked artist, someone who puts so much pressure on themselves to create something brilliant that they end up unable to create anything at all. Until one day, exhausted, they let go. They abandon the project, rest, take a walk, travel without a plan. And there, in the middle of nothingness, a new idea is born, alive, spontaneous, free of pressure. This is the power of detachment. When you let go, what's true either returns or finally has space to be born. This state of free creation, of connection with the self, is the opposite of the ego's logic. The ego wants control, results, performance. The self seeks expression, truth, harmony. When the ego steps aside, the self takes its place, gently, It doesn't force. It shows the way, but doesn't demand. It reveals itself through what brings you joy, even if no one sees it, even if it leads nowhere. And that is where detachment shows its most beautiful face. It's not just loss, it's transition. A bridge between who you were and who you can become, between the version of you that needed to prove something and the one who just needs to be. You return to yourself, no excess, no noise, and without the weights that no longer belong to you. The space that opens after letting go isn't a void to fear. It's fertile ground, waiting for your real presence. And there, life doesn't scream, it whispers. And you, more attentive, more clear inside, begin to truly listen. In the end, it all comes down to one quiet gesture, opening your hand, letting go of control, of images, of fears, of repeated stories. Not out of exhaustion, though sometimes that's where it begins, but out of clarity. Because eventually, the effort to hold on begins to cost more than the loss itself. Attachment, as familiar as it may feel, is not love. It is born from fear, from lack, from the attempt to keep alive something that may have already fulfilled its purpose. To love is to let the other exist, to let the experience happen, to let life flow, even when it doesn't match our expectations. Control is not strength. It's a more sophisticated form of resistance. It's the ego trying to bend reality to its will. But living by this logic keeps us in constant tension, at war with the present. And no soul can survive that for long. Jung reminds us that healing doesn't happen by forcing change, but by accepting what is. When we stop fighting life and begin to listen to it. When we stop chasing what should be and face what already is, with honesty. Acceptance is not resignation, it's openness. And it is through this openness that true transformation enters. So perhaps the real question now is, what are you still holding on to? What image, story, person, or expectation still takes up space inside you and prevents the new from arriving? What might finally breathe if you let it go? Letting go is a risk, but so is holding on. And often the risk of staying stuck is greater than the fear of change. We're not here to play roles, we're here to live. And to truly live takes courage. The courage to shed what no longer serves. The courage to draw closer to what's essential. The courage to allow yourself to be. Life begins where the illusion of control ends, and it's there, in that quiet, intimate place that we return to ourselves, not as an ideal, but as a presence. And from there, everything that truly matters finds its way.